Sometimes grief makes us do things that look crazy to everyone else. When Frank Delaney spent his son's college fund on a crumbling airport, his whole town turned against him. The local news called him a fool. His neighbors whispered behind his back. But Frank couldn't shake the feeling that his late wife was trying to tell him something through his dreams. So he picked up his tools and started clearing the overgrown runways by himself. That's when strange things began happening. Radio broadcasts from an empty control tower, runway lights flickering without electricity, hidden blueprints from the Cold War era. What Frank discovered buried beneath that forgotten airport was worth over $200 million. But the real treasure wasn't money. It was the truth about his family's hidden past and a chance to honor heroes the world had forgotten. When powerful developers showed up with bulldozers and threats, Frank had to make the hardest choice of his life. What would you risk to uncover a secret that could change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Main Street in Millbrook, Ohio, a town that had forgotten how to dream. Frank Delaney stood in the doorway of his garage, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen too many years of honest work. At 53, he carried himself like a man who had learned that life could break you in ways you never expected, but that you kept going anyway because giving up wasn't an option when you had people counting on you. His garage sat between Murphy's Hardware, which had been closing early for the past 6 months, and what used to be Henderson's Five and Dime, before it became another empty storefront with soap-streaked windows. The whole downtown looked like a mouth with missing teeth, gaps where prosperity used to smile. Frank had watched this slow decline for years, but it had accelerated after the plant closures. Young folks packed up and headed for Columbus or Cincinnati, leaving behind the older generation to tend a garden that seemed determined to return to wilderness. "Dad, you've got Mrs. Patterson's Buick making that noise again." Danny's voice carried from inside the garage, tinged with the particular brand of teenage exasperation that Frank remembered from his own youth. At 17, Danny had inherited his mother's quick mind and his father's stubborn streak, though Frank suspected the boy got a double dose of the latter. Frank stepped back into the familiar embrace of motor oil and metal, where problems had solutions and hard work usually paid off. Danny was bent over the Buick's engine, his dark hair falling across his forehead, the same way Sarah's used to when she concentrated on her crossword puzzles. The resemblance still caught Frank off guard sometimes, a sweet ache that he'd learned to carry like an old injury that predicted rain. "Alternators going?" Danny said without looking up, "but she's not going to want to hear that." "No," Frank agreed, pulling on his work gloves. "She's going to want to hear it's a $5 fix that'll last another 10 years. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that comes between people who understand each other's rhythms. Frank had taught Danny everything about engine show to listen to them, how to feel what they needed, how to coax life from worn parts that anyone else would have thrown away. It was the kind of knowledge that passed from father to son, like an inheritance, practical wisdom that couldn't be learned from books. The bell above the garage door chimed, and Mrs. Chen shuffled in carrying a plate covered with aluminum foil. She was pushing 80, but moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate a world that wasn't always kind to elderly Chinese women in small Ohio towns. Frank had known her for 20 years, ever since she'd moved to Millbrook to be closer to her daughter. Her husband had passed the year before Sarah did, and they'd bonded over the shared understanding of what it meant to wake up each morning to an empty house. "You boys need to eat," she said, setting the plate on Frank's workbench. "Real food, not whatever you've been living on." Frank lifted the foil to reveal homemade dumplings, still warm. The gesture was typical of Mrs. Chen practical kindness, delivered without fuss or expectation of thanks. In a town where people were increasingly isolated by their own struggles, she remained stubbornly generous. "You don't need to keep feeding us," Frank said, though he was already reaching for one of the dumplings. "I need to keep cooking," she replied. "Too much food for one person. Besides, Sarah would haunt me if I let you waste away." The mention of Sarah's name settled over them like dust in afternoon light. It had been 2 years since cancer had taken her, 2 years since Frank's world had reorganized itself around the absence at its center. He still wore his wedding ring, still kept her coffee mug in the cabinet, still sometimes reached for the phone to call her when something interesting happened. Grief, he'd learned, wasn't something you got over. It was something you got used to carrying. Danny had taken his mother's death differently, retreating into schoolwork and part-time jobs with the single-minded focus of someone trying to outrun sorrow. He'd grown serious beyond his years, worried about college applications and scholarships, with an intensity that reminded Frank of Sarah planning their wedding, determined to control every detail because some things in life were too important to leave to chance. "College letters should start coming soon," Mrs. Chen said, as if reading Frank's thoughts. She had a talent for knowing what people were thinking, probably from years of watching human nature unfold across her kitchen table. Danny straightened up from the engine, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Got accepted to Ohio State last week. Engineering program." Frank felt a surge of pride mixed with something that might have been panic. Ohio State meant Danny would be gone, meant the garage would be quiet, meant Frank would be truly alone for the first time since Sarah got sick. He'd been saving every spare dollar for Danny's education, working weekends and holidays, taking on jobs other mechanics wouldn't touch. The boy's future was the one thing Frank felt he could still control. "That's wonderful," Mrs. Chen said, and Frank could hear genuine joy in her voice. Sarah would be so proud. Danny's expression softened at the mention of his mother. Even now, 2 years later, he still looked for her approval in the empty spaces where she used to be. Frank recognized the habit because he did it too, making decisions based on what Sarah would have wanted, keeping faith with a love that death couldn't quite erase. The afternoon wore on with the steady rhythm of work. Frank replaced Mrs. Patterson's alternator, while Danny handled an oil change on Pete Morrison's pickup. Pete owned the diner down the street and had been coming to Frank for automotive advice since before Danny was born. He was one of the few business owners who'd managed to keep his doors open, mainly because people always needed somewhere to drink coffee and complain about their troubles. Around 4 o'clock, Pete himself wandered over, drawn by the smell of Mrs. Chen's dumplings and the prospect of avoiding the dinner rush preparation for another 10 minutes. "Heard Rodriguez down at the bank is getting pressure from his bosses again," Pete said, settling onto an overturned crate that served as the garage's unofficial conversation spot. More talk about consolidating branches. Frank tightened a bolt with more force than necessary. Rodriguez had been pressuring him about the mortgage on the garage, suggesting it might be time to consider selling and moving somewhere with better opportunities. As if opportunities were something you could pack in a suitcase and carry from place to place. "Man's just doing his job," Frank said, though he didn't sound convinced. "His job is keeping people in their homes, not pushing them out," Pete replied. "Sometimes I think these bank people forget we're not just numbers on a spreadsheet." Danny looked up from the oil change. "Maybe we should consider it, Dad. The garage isn't exactly making us rich." Frank felt something tighten in his chest. The garage was more than a business. It was the place where he'd built his life with Sarah, where she'd brought him lunch on slow afternoons, where Danny had taken his first steps between the tool bench and the hydraulic lift. Selling would be like admitting that the life they'd built here didn't matter anymore. "This place has been good to us," Frank said quietly. "Your mother painted those walls. You learned to work on these floors. Some things are worth more than money." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. She understood the weight of place, the way certain locations held the shape of the people who'd loved them. Her own house was full of furniture that had belonged to her late husband, rooms arranged exactly as they'd been when he was alive. As the day wound down, Frank walked through his house with the careful attention of someone conducting inventory. The living room still held Sarah's reading chair, positioned to catch the best light from the western window. Her bookmarks still protruded from half-finished novels, marking places she'd never returned to. The kitchen counter displayed her collection of ceramic roosters, each one a small celebration of domestic happiness that now seemed to mock the silence. In the bedroom, Frank sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out the wooden toolbox where he kept his most important possessions. Inside, beneath insurance papers and the deed to the house, lay Sarah's photo album. The leather cover was worn smooth from handling, and the pages held the visual history of their 23 years together. Wedding pictures where they both looked impossibly young. Danny's first steps, first day of school, high school graduation, Sarah's last birthday, where she'd insisted on making her own cake, despite the chemotherapy fatigue. Frank turned the pages slowly, allowing himself to remember when their future had stretched out ahead of them like an open road. They'd planned to travel after Danny graduated, maybe visit Sarah's cousins in California, or take that cruise to Alaska she'd always talked about. Instead, he was left with photographs and the persistent ache of unfinished conversations. Danny appeared in the doorway, hesitant in the way teenagers get when they want to talk about something important but don't know how to begin. "You okay, Dad?" Frank closed the album carefully. "Just thinking about your mother. She'd be proud of you getting into Ohio State." "She'd be worried about the money," Danny said, settling into the chair by the window. "You know how she was about debt." Frank did know. Sarah had kept their household budget in a spiral notebook, tracking every expense with the devotion of someone who'd grown up understanding that money was something you held on to because you never knew when it might run out. She would have found a way to pay for Danny's education without borrowing, probably by working extra shifts at the hospital where she'd been a nurse. "We'll manage," Frank said. "That's what people do. They manage." Danny studied his father's face in the lamplight. "Sometimes I wonder what she'd think about us now, whether we're doing okay without her." The question hung in the air like smoke from a candle that had just been blown out. Frank wondered the same thing every day. Were they honoring Sarah's memory or just going through the motions of living? Were they building something meaningful or just marking time until they could be with her again? "I think she'd want us to be happy," Frank finally said, "but I think she'd understand that happiness takes time to find again." Outside, Millbrook settled into evening quiet. Streetlights flickered on along Main Street, illuminating empty sidewalks and closed storefronts. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the flat Ohio countryside, carrying its cargo toward places where people still believed in the possibility of something better. Frank returned the photo album to its place in the toolbox, next to the small velvet box that held Sarah's engagement ring. He'd never been able to bring himself to put it away permanently, but he couldn't bear to see it sitting on her dresser either. So it lived in the toolbox with the other treasures, too precious to display, but too important to discard. As he prepared for bed, Frank found himself thinking about dreams. Not the ambitious kind that young people chase, but the quiet dreams that come in sleep, the ones where the dead visit the living and sometimes try to tell them things they need to know. Lately, Sarah had been appearing more frequently in his dreams, always in places he didn't recognize, always accompanied by a man in a vintage pilot's uniform who seemed familiar, but whose face Frank could never quite remember upon waking. The pilot never spoke, but Sarah always seemed to be trying to tell Frank something important, something urgent. She'd point toward distant horizons or gesture at objects Frank couldn't quite see clearly. When he woke, he was left with the frustrating sense that he'd missed something crucial, like arriving at a movie theater just as the important scene was ending. Tonight, as Frank settled into the empty bed that still smelled faintly of Sarah's perfume, he found himself hoping the dreams would come again. Maybe this time he'd understand what she was trying to tell him. Maybe this time he'd be smart enough to listen. Outside his window, the night settled over Millbrook like a blanket pulled up to a sleeper's chin. In a few hours, another day would begin, bringing with it the familiar routines of work and worry, the steady progression of ordinary life in a town that time seemed to be forgetting. But in the space between waking and sleeping, in the realm where love transcends death and the impossible sometimes feels within reach, Frank Delaney prepared to receive whatever message his wife might have for him. He closed his eyes and waited for morning, or for dreams, whichever came first. Frank hadn't planned to attend the county auction. He'd driven past the courthouse that Saturday morning on his way to pick up parts for Mrs. Patterson's Buick, when he noticed the crowd gathered around the auctioneer's podium. Something about the scene drew him in. Maybe it was the way the morning light caught the dust motes, dancing above the assembled bidders, or maybe it was simply the human need to witness other people's endings. The auctioneer, a thin man, with a voice that carried across the courthouse square like a carnival barker's, was working his way through a collection of farm equipment and household goods. Frank recognized some of the items from the Henderson place the family had finally given up fighting the bank and moved to Florida to live with their daughter. It was a story that had become depressingly common in Millbrook. Frank found himself standing next to Pete Morrison, who was eyeing a restaurant-grade coffee maker with the calculating look of a man who spent most of his profits on equipment repairs. "Didn't expect to see you here," Pete said without taking his eyes off the auction block. "Didn't expect to be here," Frank replied, "just passing through." The auctioneer moved on to larger items, and Frank was about to leave when he heard the words that would change everything. "Next up, we have Millbrook Municipal Airport, a 37-acre property including runways, hangar facilities, and control tower. Bidding starts at $15,000. Frank felt something shift inside his chest, like a gear clicking into place. The airport. He hadn't thought about it in years, but suddenly he could picture it perfectly the way it had looked when he was 12 years old, and his father had taken him there to watch the crop dusters fuel up. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. The smell of aviation fuel, the sound of propeller engines warming up, the sense that the whole world was spread out beyond those runways waiting to be explored. 15,000. "Do I hear 15? The auctioneer called. A man in an expensive suit raised his hand. Frank recognized him as one of the developers who'd been circling Millbrook like vultures, buying up property for strip malls and chain restaurants. Behind him stood two other men, in similar suits, all of them wearing the confident expressions of people who were used to getting what they wanted. 15,000 to the gentleman in the blue suit. "Do I hear 20? Frank found his hand rising before his brain could stop it. 20,000 to the gentleman in the work shirt. "Do I hear 25? Pete turned to stare at Frank with the expression of someone watching a friend step in front of a moving truck. "Frank, what are you doing?" Frank didn't answer because he didn't know. All he knew was that something deep in his chest was telling him the airport belonged to him, that he was supposed to have it, that Sarah had been trying to tell him about it in those dreams where she stood beside the vintage Pilot. The bidding escalated quickly. 25 became 30. 30 became 35. The developers seemed annoyed, but not particularly concerned. They were probably used to outbidding locals who got sentimental about old buildings. Frank could feel Danny's college fund burning a hole in his mental pocket, could hear Sarah's voice warning him about making impulsive decisions. But he kept bidding anyway. At $50,000, one of the developers dropped out. At 60, the second one followed suit. It was down to Frank and the man in the blue suit, who was now looking at Frank with the kind of irritation reserved for insects that refuse to be swatted. 70,000, Frank called out, his voice steadier than he felt. The developer conferred with his associates, their heads bent together in urgent whispers. Finally, he straightened up and nodded to the auctioneer. 75,000. Frank closed his eyes and saw Sarah standing in a field he didn't recognize, pointing toward something beyond the horizon. The pilot beside her nodded encouragingly, as if he understood something Frank hadn't figured out yet. 100,000, Frank said. The crowd fell silent. $100,000 was serious money in Millbrook, the kind of money that represented years of careful saving or desperate borrowing. The developer's confident expression cracked slightly around the edges. 110, the developer countered, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Frank thought about Danny's acceptance letter to Ohio State, about the scholarship applications they'd filled out together, about the future he'd promised his son. Then he thought about Sarah's face in his dreams, about the urgency in her expression, about the feeling that something important was waiting for him at that airport. 125,000, Frank said quietly. The developer threw up his hands and walked away, muttering something about crazy locals and bad investments. The auctioneer called for other bidders twice more, But the crowd had gone quiet, everyone staring at Frank as if he'd just announced his intention to fly to the moon. Sold for $125,000 to bidder number 47. Frank stood there for a moment, letting the reality sink in. He had just spent Danny's entire college fund on 37 acres of cracked asphalt and abandoned buildings. He had made the most impulsive, irrational decision of his life, and he couldn't explain why it felt like the rightest thing he'd ever done. The paperwork took an hour. Frank signed his name to documents that transferred ownership of Millbrook Municipal Airport from the county to Frank Delaney, private citizen and apparent lunatic. The clerk who processed the transaction kept giving him concerned looks, as if she expected him to suddenly come to his senses and demand his money back. By the time Frank drove home, word had already spread through Millbrook's efficient gossip network. Mrs. Chen was waiting on his front porch, her face a mask of polite concern that didn't quite hide her bewilderment. "Frank," she said carefully, "Pete Morrison called me. He said you bought the airport." "I did," Frank replied, surprising himself with how normal his voice sounded. "With what money?" Frank sat down on the porch steps beside her. "Danny's college fund." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned not to judge other people's decisions too quickly. Finally, she asked, "Why?" "I don't know," Frank admitted. "I just had to." When Danny came home from his job at the grocery store, he found Frank sitting at the kitchen table with the deed to the airport spread out in front of him. The boy took one look at his father's face and knew something had changed. "Dad, what's wrong?" Frank told him about the auction, about the bidding war, about the moment when everything else had fallen away except the certainty that he needed to own that piece of land. He watched his son's face go through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a kind of devastated anger that Frank had never seen before. "You spent my college money," Danny said slowly, "on an abandoned airport." "Yes." "Without talking to me about it." "Yes." Danny stood there for a moment, his hands clenched at his sides, looking like he was trying to decide whether to scream or cry. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and controlled in a way that was somehow worse than shouting would have been. "Mom would have talked to me first," he said. "Mom would never have thrown away my future for some crazy impulse." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Danny was right, of course. Sarah would have sat them both down at this same kitchen table, would have made lists and considered alternatives, would have found a way to honor whatever instinct was driving Frank without sacrificing their son's education. But Sarah wasn't here, and Frank was making decisions based on dreams and feelings he couldn't explain to a rational 17-year-old who had every right to be furious. "I know it doesn't make sense," Frank said. "I know it looks crazy. But something is telling me this is important, that your mother is trying to tell me something through these dreams." "Dreams?" Danny's voice cracked slightly. "You bankrupted our family because of dreams." That night, Frank lay in bed staring at the ceiling and wondering what he had done. Danny hadn't spoken to him since their conversation in the kitchen, had eaten dinner in silence and gone to his room without saying goodnight. The house felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of Frank's decision was pressing down on all of them. But when he finally fell asleep, Sarah was waiting for him in the dream. She was standing beside the vintage Pilot on a hill overlooking the airport, and for the first time, she was smiling. The Pilot tipped his cap to Frank in a gesture that seemed to say, "Well done," and Sarah mouthed words that Frank couldn't quite hear, but somehow understood. When he woke up, Frank knew he had made the right choice, even if he couldn't explain it to anyone else. The airport was calling him, and Sarah had been trying to point him toward it all along. Whatever secrets lay buried in those abandoned runways and forgotten hangars, Frank was going to find them, even if it cost him everything else he had left. The story broke on the local news 3 days after the auction. Frank was working under the hood of Deputy Miller's patrol car when Pete burst through the garage doors, his face flushed with excitement and something that might have been panic. "Frank, you need to see this," Pete said, brandishing his phone like evidence at a crime scene. Channel 8 just ran a story about you. They're calling you the airport dreamer. Frank wiped his hands on a shop rag and accepted the phone. The news story was worse than he'd imagined. The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a tone of barely concealed mockery, stood in front of the airport gates while describing Frank's shocking impulse purchase of the abandoned aviation facility. She interviewed several townspeople, including Councilman Bradley, who expressed concern about Frank's mental state and suggested the purchase might be grounds for a psychiatric evaluation. The worst part was the footage of Frank himself, captured by someone's cell phone during the auction. He looked wild-eyed and desperate, his hand shooting up to bid with the jerky movements of a man possessed. The caption at the bottom of the screen read, "Local mechanic spends son's college fund on derelict airport." "They make me look like I've lost my mind," Frank said, handing the phone back to Pete. "Have you?" Pete asked gently. Before Frank could answer, the garage door chimed, and Rodriguez walked in. The banker looked uncomfortable, his usual polished confidence replaced by the awkward demeanor of someone delivering bad news to a friend. "Frank, we need to talk," Rodriguez said, glancing at Pete with obvious reluctance. Pete took the hint and made himself scarce, muttering something about checking on the coffee at the diner. When they were alone, Rodriguez pulled out a manila folder and set it on Frank's workbench. "The bank is concerned about your recent financial decisions," Rodriguez began carefully. "Given the substantial withdrawal from your savings account and the unusual nature of the purchase, my supervisors are questioning your ability to maintain your existing loan obligations." Frank felt his jaw tighten. "My mortgage payments are current." "Yes, but you've depleted your liquid assets. If something happened to the garage, an equipment failure, a liability claim, a drop in business, you'd have no cushion. The bank needs assurance that you can meet your obligations." Rodriguez opened the folder and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "I've prepared some preliminary documents for a property assessment. If you're serious about this airport venture, you'll need to demonstrate its viability as collateral, or we'll need to discuss alternative arrangements for your existing loans." Frank stared at the papers without picking them up. Alternative arrangements. In banker speak, that meant foreclosure procedures, payment restructuring, or forced sale. Rodriguez was giving him a polite warning that his financial house of cards was about to collapse. "How long do I have?" Frank asked. 60 days to provide a business plan or feasibility study for the airport property. After that, we'll need to review all your accounts." Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. "Frank, I've known you for 10 years. You're a good man, but this airport thing has people worried. Maybe it's time to consider cutting your losses." After Rodriguez left, Frank sat alone in his garage, surrounded by the familiar tools and machinery that had been his livelihood for 2 decades. For the first time since the auction, he allowed himself to truly consider what he had done. He'd spent his son's college fund on property he'd never seen, up close, driven by dreams and impulses he couldn't explain to anyone, including himself. But that evening, instead of going home to face Danny's cold silence, Frank drove out to the airport. The chain-link fence around the property was rusted but intact, topped with coils of wire that had lost their sharpness to years of weather. Frank had the key now, heavy brass thing that looked like it belonged to a medieval castellan. He unlocked the gate with hands that trembled slightly from anticipation or dread. The main runway stretched out before him like a concrete river, cracked and sprouting weeds but still holding the ghost of its original purpose. Frank walked down the centerline, his footsteps echoing in the vast silence, and tried to imagine what this place had been like in its prime. The hangar loomed ahead of him, a massive steel structure that seemed to lean slightly to one side, as if tired from holding itself upright for so many years. Inside the hangar, Frank found the remnants of aviation history. Old oil stains mapped the floor where aircraft had once been serviced. Tool benches lined the walls, their surfaces scarred by decades of use. In one corner, he discovered a small office with windows that looked out over the runway. The desk was still there, along with filing cabinets and a wooden chair that creaked when Frank tested its stability. It was in the bottom drawer of the desk that Frank found the first clue that his purchase might not have been as crazy as everyone thought. Tucked behind a collection of old maintenance logs was a small cardboard box, and inside the box was a bronze star medal, tarnished with age but still bearing the clear inscription, "For heroic achievement, Thomas Kowalski, 1953. Frank turned the medal over in his hands, feeling its weight. The name meant nothing to him, but something about finding it here, in this forgotten place, felt significant. He slipped the medal into his jacket pocket and continued exploring. The control tower was accessible via a narrow staircase that Frank climbed with careful steps, testing each rung for safety. At the top, he found a small room lined with windows that offered a panoramic view of the entire airport complex. The radio equipment was still there, ancient but somehow dignified, like an elderly gentleman in a faded suit. When Frank flipped what looked like a power switch, nothing happened, but he hadn't really expected it to. As the sun set behind the hangar, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Frank stood at the control tower windows and tried to imagine what Sarah had been trying to tell him. The pilot in his dreams always stood beside her, pointing toward this place, as if it held answers to questions Frank hadn't thought to ask. When he finally drove home, Frank found Danny waiting in the kitchen, homework spread across the table like accusations. The boy looked up when his father entered, and Frank saw something different in his expression. Not forgiveness, but perhaps a willingness to listen. "I went to the airport today," Frank said. Danny set down his pencil. "And? It's not just a pile of concrete and steel. There's history there. Someone cared about that place once." Frank pulled the bronze star from his pocket and set it on the table between them. "I found this in a desk drawer. Someone named Thomas Kowalski earned this for heroic achievement." Danny picked up the medal, studying it with the careful attention he usually reserved for engine components. "Why would someone leave this behind?" "Maybe they didn't leave it behind," Frank said. "Maybe they hid it there for someone to find." For the first time since the auction, father and son sat together without the weight of anger between them. The medal seemed to bridge some gap, offering the possibility that Frank's impulse purchase might have been guided by something more than madness. Outside, Millbrook settled into another quiet evening, but inside the Delaney kitchen, two people were beginning to believe that some mysteries were worth solving, even if the cost was higher than they could afford to pay. Frank began spending his evenings at the airport, arriving after closing the garage and staying until darkness made further work impossible. He'd equipped himself with basic tools, a push mower he'd bought second-hand, pruning shears, trash bags, and a crowbar for the more stubborn obstacles that time and neglect had created. The work was methodical and oddly soothing. Frank would start at one end of the property and work his way across, clearing weeds, picking up debris, and slowly revealing the bones of what had once been a functioning airport. With each day, the place looked a little more like it was supposed to, and Frank felt a corresponding sense of rightness that he couldn't explain to anyone else. It was during his third week of evening maintenance that Frank discovered the basement level beneath the main hangar. He'd been trying to move a heavy workbench when he noticed that the concrete floor sounded hollow in one particular spot. Further investigation revealed a seam in the floor, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look, and a recessed handle that took considerable effort to lift. The stairs descended into darkness that his flashlight could barely penetrate. The air below was stale but dry, suggesting the space had been well sealed against moisture. Frank descended carefully, his footsteps echoing in the enclosed space, until he reached a room that took his breath away. The basement was larger than the hangar above it, stretching out beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. Along the walls, Frank could make out the shapes of equipment covered in canvas tarps. When he pulled back one of the coverings, he found a radio setup that looked like something from a Cold War movie, vacuum tubes and switches and dials, labeled with technical specifications that were beyond his understanding. But it was the desk in the center of the room that captured Frank's attention. It was smaller than the one upstairs, more personal somehow, and when Frank settled into the chair behind it, he felt like he was sitting in someone's secret command center. The drawers were locked, but Frank's crowbar made quick work of the old mechanism. Inside the bottom drawer, wrapped in oiled leather, Frank found a logbook. The cover was embossed with the name Captain James Morrison and filled with entries dating from 1951 to 1962. Frank opened it carefully, treating the aged pages like archaeological artifacts. The entries were cryptic but intriguing. Morrison wrote about cargo runs and special deliveries, about flights that departed at odd hours and landed at airfields that weren't marked on any civilian maps. There were references to the package and the professor and coordinates that seemed to lead to locations all over the Midwest. One entry, dated November 15, 1953, caught Frank's attention. Package delivered to TK as arranged. Professor confirms receipt and storage in designated location. Payment complete. This should be the last run for this particular cargo, but TK insists on maintaining security protocols indefinitely. Sometimes I think he knows something the rest of us don't. TK Thomas Kowalski, the name on the bronze star. Frank was beginning to understand that his airport had been involved in something more complicated than civilian aviation. He photographed several pages of the logbook with his phone, then rewrapped it carefully and returned it to the drawer. As he climbed back up to the hangar level, Frank's mind was racing with possibilities. What kind of cargo required such secrecy? What was significant enough that a war hero like Kowalski would dedicate years of his life to protecting it? When Frank arrived home that night, he found Danny waiting with a manila envelope and an expression that fell somewhere between excitement and apprehension. "Scholarship letter from Ohio State," Danny explained, holding up the envelope. "Haven't opened it yet." Frank studied his son's face. "Why not?" "Because if I got it, I can still go to college despite what you did. And if I didn't get it, then your airport purchase really did ruin my future." Danny turned the envelope over in his hands. "Either way, everything changes after I open this." Frank sat down at the kitchen table. "Want me to open it?" "No." Danny took a deep breath and tore open the envelope with the decisive motion of someone removing a bandage. He read silently for a moment, his expression unreadable, then set the letter down on the table. "I got it," he said quietly. "Partial scholarship. Covers about 60% of tuition." Frank felt relief wash over him like a wave. Danny could still go to college. The airport purchase hadn't completely destroyed his son's future, even if it had made things more complicated. "That's wonderful," Frank said, reaching for the letter. Danny pulled it back. "Is it? Because now I have to decide whether to take on massive debt for the remaining 40% or whether to stay here and help you figure out what the hell you've gotten us into." The question hung between them like a challenge. Frank wanted to tell Danny to take the scholarship and run, to build a life far away from Millbrook and his father's inexplicable impulses. But he also wanted his son's help in solving the mystery that was growing more intriguing by the day. "I found something at the airport tonight," Frank said, pulling out his phone to show Danny the photographs of Morrison's logbook. Evidence that the place was used for more than just civilian flights. Danny studied the images with the focused attention he brought to complex mechanical problems. This Captain Morrison guy was running some kind of smuggling operation. Or intelligence work. Look at the dates, early 50s, height of the Cold War. And remember the medal I found belonged to Thomas Kowalski. What are the odds that's a coincidence? They spent the next hour researching on Danny's laptop, cross-referencing names and dates, and trying to piece together a story from fragments of information. Morrison's obituary described him as a decorated veteran and civilian pilot, but gave no details about his wartime service. Kowalski was even more mysterious. No obituary, no military records, no trace of him after 1953. "It's like he just disappeared," Danny said, scrolling through search results that yielded nothing useful. Frank thought about the basement room, about the elaborate radio equipment, and the careful way Morrison had documented his flights. Maybe disappearing was the whole point. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Frank was opening the garage when a black sedan pulled up to the curb. and two men in dark suits got out. They looked like federal agents from a television show, complete with sunglasses and the kind of serious expressions that suggested they weren't here to discuss automotive repair. "Mr. Delaney?" The taller of the two men approached with careful, measured steps. "I'm Agent Martinez, FBI. This is Agent Thompson. We'd like to talk to you about your recent property acquisition." Frank felt his stomach drop. "The airport?" "Among other things. Is there somewhere private we can talk?" Frank led them into the garage office, his mind racing through possibilities. Had he stumbled onto some kind of crime scene? Was the airport purchase somehow illegal? Were Morrison and Kowalski fugitives rather than heroes? Agent Martinez settled into the chair across from Frank's desk with the practiced ease of someone who conducted a lot of interviews. "Mr. Delaney, we understand you've been exploring the basement level of the hangar facility." Frank tried to keep his expression neutral. "How do you know that?" "The property has been under periodic surveillance for several decades. When you triggered the motion sensors in the basement, our system flagged it for investigation." Martinez leaned forward slightly. "We need to know exactly what you found down there." The truth seemed like the safest option. Frank told them about the radio equipment, about Morrison's logbook, about the mysterious references to cargo and special deliveries. He showed them the photographs on his phone and described his theory that the airport had been involved in Cold War intelligence operations. When he finished, the two agents exchanged a look that suggested Frank had confirmed something they already suspected. "Mr. Delaney," Agent Martinez said carefully, "how much do you know about your late wife's family history?" The question hit Frank like a physical blow. Sarah's family history was a subject they'd rarely discussed during their marriage, mainly because there wasn't much to discuss. Her parents had died when she was young, and she'd been raised by an aunt who had passed away shortly after Frank and Sarah's wedding. Sarah had always been matter-of-fact about her orphan status, treating it as simply one of those unfortunate circumstances that some people had to navigate. "Sarah's parents died when she was 7, Frank said slowly. "Car accident. She was raised by her Aunt Martha in Cleveland." Agent Martinez nodded, but his expression suggested this wasn't news to him. "What did Sarah tell you about her father's work?" "He was a janitor at some government building." "Why are you asking about Sarah? She's been dead for 2 years." Agent Thompson spoke for the first time, his voice gentler than his partner's. "Mr. Delaney, your wife's father wasn't a janitor. His name was Thomas Kowalski, and he was one of the most effective intelligence handlers the CIA ever employed." Frank felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. The bronze star he'd found in the airport desk belonged to Sarah's father. The man he'd been researching, the mysterious TK from Morrison's logbook, was his late wife's father, a man Sarah had believed was a janitor who died in a car accident when she was 7 years old. "That's impossible," Frank said, but even as he spoke, he was remembering details that suddenly took on new significance. Sarah's unusual facility with languages, her uncanny ability to read people's motivations, the way she sometimes seemed to know things about current events before they appeared in the news. Thomas Kowalski faked his death in 1962 to protect his family from Soviet retaliation, Martinez continued. His work involved managing a network of defectors and assets during some of the most dangerous years of the Cold War. The airport was one of several safe houses he used for debriefing and relocating high-value defectors. Frank's head was spinning. If he faked his death, then where did he go? What happened to him? He took on a new identity and moved to Millbrook, where he could keep an eye on the airport and its contents while maintaining his cover. He married a local woman named Helen Chen in 1965. The name hit Frank like a thunderbolt. Helen Chen, Mrs. Chen, his neighbor, the woman who had been feeding him and Danny, who had known Sarah's father, who had acted like she understood grief in a way that went deeper than simple sympathy. "Mrs. Chen," Frank whispered. "Thomas Kowalski became Thomas Chen," Martinez confirmed. "He lived quietly in Millbrook for 40 years, until his death in 2020. His widow is still alive. Frank sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications. Mrs. Chen wasn't just a kind neighbor, she was Sarah's stepmother. She had known the truth about Sarah's father all along, had watched Frank marry Sarah and raise Danny, all while keeping the biggest secret imaginable. Why didn't Sarah know? Frank asked. Kowalski felt it was safer for everyone if Sarah believed her parents were dead, Thompson explained. The fewer people who knew his real identity, the better. He maintained surveillance on Sarah throughout her life, but from a distance. When she moved to Millbrook to work at the hospital, it wasn't coincidence he arranged for her to get the job so he could be closer to her. Frank thought about all the times Mrs. Chen had seemed to know exactly what Sarah needed, how she'd appeared with meals and advice and comfort at precisely the right moments. She hadn't been a kind stranger, she'd been protecting her stepdaughter, honoring a promise to a man who'd sacrificed everything to keep his family safe. "What's in the airport basement?" Frank asked. What was so important that Kowalski spent 40 years guarding it? Martinez and Thompson exchanged another look, and Frank got the sense that he'd reached the limit of what they were willing to share. "That's classified, Mr. Delaney. What I can tell you is that certain assets were placed in secure storage during the Cold War, and those assets were never officially recovered or redistributed. As far as the government is concerned, they don't exist. But they do exist. Hypothetically, yes. And hypothetically, if someone were to discover these assets, they would belong to whoever found them, provided they hadn't been obtained through illegal means." Frank stared at the agents. "You're telling me that whatever is hidden at that airport is legally mine?" "We're telling you that the government has no official interest in property that officially doesn't exist," Martinez said carefully. "However, there are other parties who might be very interested in recovering assets they believe belong to them." Before Frank could ask what other parties, Agent Thompson's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. "We need to go," he said to Martinez. "Mr. Delaney, a word of advice. Be very careful who you trust. Thomas Kowalski had enemies, and some of them have long memories." After the agents left, Frank sat alone in his garage office, trying to make sense of everything he'd learned. Sarah's father was a liver, had been alive for most of Sarah's adult life. Mrs. Chen was Sarah's stepmother. The airport contained assets that might be worth a fortune, but which also came with dangers he didn't understand. That afternoon, Frank closed the garage early and drove to Mrs. Chen's house. She was in her garden, tending to tomato plants with the careful attention of someone who understood that growing things required patience and dedication. When she saw Frank approaching, her expression shifted from mild surprise to resignation, as if she'd been expecting this conversation for years. "You know," she said simply, "the FBI visited me this morning. They told me about Thomas Kowalski, about Thomas Chen." Frank sat down on her porch steps. "They told me Sarah was your stepdaughter." Mrs. Chen set down her gardening tools and joined him on the steps. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, two people who had shared grief without knowing they had also shared family. "I wanted to tell you," she said finally. "So many times, especially after Sarah got sick. But Thomas made me promise. He said the secret was the only thing that kept everyone safe." "Safe from what?" "From people who still think they're fighting the Cold War. Thomas helped a lot of people defect, people who brought information that damaged Soviet intelligence operations. Some of those operations had American participants, businessmen, politicians, academics, who sold secrets for money or ideology. When the Soviet Union collapsed, those people thought they were safe. But Thomas kept records." Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "The assets at the airport, they're not just money, are they?" Thomas called it his insurance policy. Files, photographs, recordings, evidence that could destroy reputations and careers even today. He said if anything happened to him, if his enemies ever found him, he wanted someone trustworthy to decide what to do with the information. "And he chose me?" Mrs. Chen smiled sadly. "He chose Sarah, but Sarah is gone, so now it's up to you and Danny." She reached over and patted Frank's hand. "Thomas would have liked you. He always said the best people were the ones who fixed things instead of breaking them. As Frank drove home, his mind was reeling with the implications of what he'd learned. The airport wasn't just an abandoned piece of property. It was a time capsule from the Cold War, containing secrets that powerful people might kill to protect. He'd bought himself a mystery that could make him rich or get him killed, possibly both. When he arrived home, Danny was waiting with a concerned expression and a manila envelope. "Dad, we need to talk. I got a call from someone claiming to represent investors who want to buy the airport. They're offering $2 million, cash, for immediate sale." Frank took the envelope and examined the letterhead. Meridian Development Corporation, with an address in Columbus and a phone number that probably led to a switchboard designed to deflect questions. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I'd pass along the message. But Dad, these people knew things about me scholarship, your mortgage situation, even Mom's maiden name. How would developers know that kind of personal information?" Frank looked at his son and realized that their quiet life in Millbrook was over. Whether he wanted it or not, Frank had become the guardian of secrets that other people would do anything to possess. The only question now was whether he was strong enough to protect thee, and whether Sarah's father had left him the tools he needed to survive what was coming. That evening, Frank sat at his kitchen table with Mrs. Chen and Danny, sorting through a shoebox full of documents that she'd kept hidden in her attic for over 20 years. The papers told a story that was both more complicated and more dangerous than Frank had imagined. Thomas Kowalski hadn't just been an intelligence handler. He'd been the architect of one of the most successful defector programs in CIA history. Between 1951 and 1962, he'd managed the safe passage of 43 Soviet assets, including scientists, military officers, and KGB operatives who brought with them secrets that shaped American policy throughout the Cold War. But the most valuable asset he'd handled wasn't a personet, was a collection of documents known internally as the Moscow Files. These files contained detailed records of American citizens who had collaborated with Soviet intelligence, including their real names, their handlers, their methods of communication, and the specific information they had provided to the enemy. Thomas said the files were like a nuclear weapon. Mrs. Chen explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Too dangerous to use, but too important to destroy. He spent 40 years keeping them safe, waiting for the right moment to decide their fate." Danny studied a photograph of a younger Thomas Kowalski in military uniform, standing beside Captain Morrison in front of a small aircraft. Why didn't he turn them over to the FBI or the CIA when the Soviet Union collapsed? Because some of the names in those files belonged to people who were still alive, still in positions of power. Mrs. Chen replied, "Congressmen, judges, business leaders who had sold secrets in their youth and gone on to build respectable lives. Thomas said exposing them would cause more harm than good." Frank examined a map that showed the airport's underground layout in precise detail. The basement level he'd discovered was just the beginning. There were additional storage areas, emergency escape routes, and what appeared to be a vault buried even deeper beneath the hangar foundation. "The encryption key," Frank said suddenly, remembering the brass cipher wheel he'd found in Morrison's compass. "It's for decoding the files, isn't it?" Mrs. Chen nodded. "Thomas taught me how to use it, in case something happened to him. The files are written in a code that changes with each document, but the key provides the pattern for decryption." They worked until midnight, using the cipher wheel to decode several pages from the Moscow files. The names that emerged were shocking in their familiarity. A former senator who now ran a major foundation, a Supreme Court justice who had died the previous year, a pharmaceutical executive whose company had government contracts worth billions. But it was the last name on the list that made Frank's blood run cold. Rodriguez, Victor, current identity. Miguel Rodriguez, banking executive, Millbrook, Ohio. "Rodriguez isn't just the bank manager," Frank said slowly. "He's one of them. He's been watching me, watching all of us, for years." Mrs. Chen went pale. Thomas suspected, but he could never prove it. He said Rodriguez showed up in Millbrook too conveniently, too perfectly positioned to monitor the town's financial activities. Danny looked up from the documents he'd been studying. Dad, if Rodriguez is working for the Russians, then those developers who want to buy the airport aren't developers at all, Frank finished. They're agents sent to recover the files. The realization hit them like a cold wave. Frank hadn't just stumbled into a real estate opportunity, he'd walked into the middle of an espionage operation that had been dormant for decades. By purchasing the airport, he'd inadvertently triggered a sequence of events that had brought old enemies out of hiding. Mrs. Chen stood up abruptly and walked to her kitchen window, peering through the curtains at the street outside. "There's a car parked across from your house, Frank. Same car that's been there for the past 3 nights. Frank joined her at the window. A dark sedan sat under the streetlight, its occupants invisible behind tinted windows. As they watched, another car pulled up behind it, and Frank recognized Rodriguez's silver BMW. "We need to get those files," Frank said. "Tonight, before they decide to take more direct action." "It's too dangerous," Mrs. Chen protested. "Thomas spent years learning how to move undetected around that airport. You'll be walking into a trap." But Frank was already planning. His years as a mechanic had taught him to think systematically about complex problems, to break them down into manageable components. The airport's layout, the underground passages, the security measures that Thomas had installed, they were all mechanical systems that could be understood and navigated with the right approach. "Danny, I need you to stay here with Mrs. Chen," Frank said. "If something goes wrong, call Agent Martinez. His card is on my desk." "I'm coming with you," Danny replied firmly. "This is my family's legacy too. Mom would want me to help protect it." Frank looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not the teenager he'd been protecting, but the young man he'd become. Danny had inherited Sarah's intelligence and Frank's determination, and maybe it was time to trust him with the family secrets they were only now beginning to understand. "All right," Frank said, "but we do this my way, carefully, quietly, and with a plan for getting out if things go wrong." Mrs. Chen produced a set of keys from her jewelry box, each one labeled with cryptic markings that Frank now recognized as Thomas's coding system. "These will get you into the deeper levels. Thomas made me memorize the security protocols, just in case." As they prepared to leave, Frank felt a strange sense of completion, as if all the seemingly random events of the past month had been leading to this moment. Sarah's dreams, the impulse to buy the airport, the discovery of Morrison's logbook, they weren't coincidences. They were pieces of a puzzle that Sarah's father had constructed years ago, a puzzle that could only be solved by someone who loved Sarah enough to risk everything for the truth. Frank slipped Thomas's bronze star into his pocket, next to the cipher wheel and the keys to secrets that had been buried for decades. Whatever they found in the depths of the airport, whatever dangers they faced from Rodriguez and his associates, Frank knew he was finally doing what Sarah had been trying to tell him to do in those dreams. He was uncovering the truth about the people he loved, and he was protecting the legacy that Thomas Kowalski had died to preserve. As they drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook toward the airport, Frank glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the dark sedan following at a discreet distance. The game was no longer about real estate or development opportunities. It was about survival, and Frank was about to discover whether a small-town mechanic could outwit professional spies who had been playing this game for decades. But he had advantages they didn't expect. The knowledge of a man who had spent 40 years preparing for this moment, the love of a son who was ready to fight for his family's honor, and the guidance of a wife whose dreams had led him exactly where he needed to be. The airport waited in the darkness ahead, holding secrets that could change everything or destroy them all. Frank and Danny approached the airport from the east side, using a service road that Thomas's maps indicated would be less visible from the main highway. Frank had disabled his truck's interior lights and instructed Danny to keep his phone on silent, but even these precautions felt inadequate against adversaries who had been trained in surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. The night air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the abandoned runway stretched out before them like a concrete lake under the starlight. Frank used Thomas's keys to unlock a maintenance shed that he'd never noticed during his daytime visits, revealing an entrance to the underground tunnel system that connected various points around the airport property. "This is incredible," Danny whispered as they descended into the tunnel. "Grandpa Thomas built his own underground railroad." The tunnel was narrow but well constructed, with electric lighting that still functioned after decades of disuse. Frank followed the route indicated on Thomas's hand-drawn map, counting steps and looking for landmarks until they reached a heavy steel door marked only with the number 7. Beyond the door lay the real heart of Thomas Kowalski's operation. The room was larger than Frank had expected, filled with filing cabinets, communication equipment, and a vault that looked like it belonged in a bank rather than an abandoned airport. But it was the wall of photographs that captured Frank's attention, surveillance photos of people entering and leaving various locations, many of them bearing dates from the 1980s and 1990s. He never stopped working, Frank realized. Even after he officially died, he kept gathering intelligence. Danny was examining a sophisticated radio setup that appeared to be capable of monitoring multiple frequencies simultaneously. "Dad, look at this. Some of these recordings are labeled with dates from last year. Someone was still using this equipment recently." Frank felt a chill of understanding. Thomas hadn't just hidden the Moscow files and disappeared. He'd continued his intelligence work until his death, updating his records and gathering new evidence of ongoing espionage activities. Rodriguez and his associates weren't just trying to recover old secrets. They were trying to eliminate evidence of current operations. The vault required 2 keys, both of which Mrs. Chen had provided, along with a numeric code that she'd made Frank memorize. Inside, Frank found exactly what Agent Martinez had hinted at: bearer bonds worth approximately $200 million, gold bars that probably dated from the Soviet era, and most importantly, 3 metal filing boxes containing the complete Moscow files. But as Frank lifted the first box from the vault, he heard something that made his blood freeze. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel outside. "Danny, get behind the radio equipment," Frank whispered urgently. "Stay hidden, no matter what happens." The steel door opened with a mechanical hiss, and Rodriguez entered the room, followed by 2 men Frank didn't recognize. In the harsh, fluorescent light, Rodriguez looked differentada, more dangerous, like a mask had been removed to reveal the predator underneath. "Good evening, Frank," Rodriguez said, his accent noticeably thicker than it had been in all their previous conversations. "I see you found Thomas's little treasure room." Frank straightened slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Victor Rodriguez, I presume. Or do you prefer your real name?" Rodriguez smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Very good. Thomas trained you well, even from beyond the grave." "Yes, I am Victor Rodriguez, formerly of the GRU. I've been waiting 20 years for someone to lead me to this room." One of Rodriguez's companions, a thin man with pale eyes, stepped forward and spoke in heavily accented English. "Where are the files, old man? We know they are here." Frank glanced at the filing boxes, trying to calculate distances and angles. He was outnumbered 3 to 1, and his opponents were almost certainly armed. But he had one advantage they didn't know about. Danny was hidden behind the radio equipment, and Frank could see him slowly reaching for something that looked like an emergency alarm. "The files are in the vault," Frank said, buying time. "But I'm curious about something. How did you know I'd found this place?" Rodriguez pulled out a small device that Frank recognized as a motion detector. Thomas was thorough, but not perfect. He installed sensors to alert him when someone entered his sacred chamber, but he never considered that those same sensors could be monitored by someone else. "I've been tracking every movement in this facility since you bought the property." "Then why didn't you just take the files yourself?" "Because the vault requires keys and codes that Thomas never shared with anyone except his wife. We needed you to do the hard work of convincing her to cooperate." Rodriguez gestured toward the filing boxes. "Now please, Step away from the vault so my associates can collect what belongs to us. Frank didn't move. These files don't belong to you. They belong to the American people, to history, to the families of the people whose names are in there. The pale-eyed man pulled out a pistol with practiced efficiency. Step away, or we will kill you and take the files anyway. It was then that Danny triggered the alarm. The sound was deafening in the enclosed spacer klaxon that Thomas had probably installed to summon help in exactly this kind of situation. But more importantly, the alarm activated other systems throughout the underground complex. Emergency lights began flashing, steel doors slammed shut to isolate different sections, and somewhere in the distance, Frank could hear the sound of radio equipment broadcasting automated distress signals. In the confusion, Frank dove toward the vault and grabbed two of the filing boxes, while Danny emerged from his hiding place with what appeared to be a very old but functional flare gun. "Nobody move!" Danny shouted, his voice cracking slightly but his aim steady. Rodriguez laughed. A child with a flare gun. How touching. But the pale-eyed man was looking around the room with growing alarm. "Victor, we need to leave. Now. Those radio signals, they're broadcasting on emergency frequencies. Police, FBI, maybe military will respond." Frank clutched the filing boxes to his chest and backed toward what he hoped was an emergency exit. "You can't hide from this forever, Rodriguez." Thomas documented everything. Every payment, every dead drop, every piece of intelligence you sold. Even if you kill us, the truth is going to come out. "The truth," Rodriguez snarled, "is that idealistic fools like Thomas Kowalski never understood that the Cold War never ended. It just became more subtle, more profitable. The information in those files is worth more than money its leverage over some of the most powerful people in America." Frank found the emergency exit handle and pulled it, revealing a narrow staircase that led upward. "Danny, go!" What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds. Danny fired the flare gun, filling the room with acrid smoke and brilliant red light. Frank pushed his son toward the stairs and followed, still carrying the filing boxes. Behind them, he could hear Rodriguez screaming orders in what sounded like Russian. They emerged from the underground complex through a concealed exit near the control tower, gasping in the cool night air. In the distance, Frank could see headlights approaching fast along the airport's access road, multiple vehicles, some of them with the distinctive light bars of police cars. The radio signals, Danny panted. They worked. Help is coming. Frank looked at the filing boxes in his arms, then at his son, who had just proven himself to be far braver and more resourceful than Frank had ever imagined. Whatever happened next, they had succeeded in preventing Rodriguez from recovering the Moscow files. Thomas Kowalski's 40-year mission to protect those secrets was complete. But as they waited for the cavalry to arrive, Frank realized that their victory had come at a cost. Rodriguez and his associates now knew exactly who they were and what they had found. The quiet life Frank had tried to build in Millbrook was over forever. From now on, they would be targets, guardians of secrets that powerful people would kill to possess. Frank had wanted to honor Sarah's memory and uncover his family's hidden history. Instead, he had inherited a war that his father-in-law had fought in shadows for decades. The first police car pulled up to the gate, followed by FBI vehicles and what looked like a military transport. Agent Martinez emerged from one of the cars, speaking rapidly into a radio as he surveyed the scene. Frank stood up slowly, still holding the filing boxes, and prepared to explain how a small-town mechanic had accidentally stumbled into the biggest intelligence operation in Cold War history. Whatever came next, he and Danny would face it together, armed with the truth and the knowledge that some secrets are worth dying to protect. The FBI command center that materialized at Millbrook Airport over the next 12 hours was unlike anything the town had ever seen. Agent Martinez had called in resources from Columbus, Cincinnati, and Washington, D.C., transforming the abandoned hangar into a high-tech operations center complete with satellite communications, computer terminals, and enough armed agents to secure a small city. Frank sat in what had once been Morrison's office, now serving as an interrogation room. while federal investigators catalogued every document in the Moscow files. Danny waited in an adjacent room under protective custody, occasionally visible through the window, as agents took his statement and explained the witness protection protocols they wanted him to consider. "The files are even more comprehensive than we expected," Agent Martinez said, settling into the chair across from Frank with a stack of folders that represented 40 years of Thomas Kowalski's intelligence work. "Your father-in-law documented not just the original Soviet assets, but their children, their associates, their business relationships. It's a complete map of a sleeper network that's been operating in plain sight for decades." Frank studied the photographs that Martinez spread across the desk. Rodriguez's real identity was confirmed: Viktor Kozlov, former GRU officer who had entered the United States in 1985 under deep cover as a business student. Over the past 35 years, he'd built a banking career that gave him access to the financial records of thousands of Americans, including government employees, military contractors, and political figures. "How many others are there?" Frank asked. "Based on these files, we estimate at least 200 active assets in positions of influence throughout the Midwest. Businessmen, academics, local politicians, law enforcement officers." Thomas identified them all, tracked their careers, documented their communications with handlers. Martinez pulled out a photograph that made Frank's stomach clench. It showed Rodriguez meeting with a man Frank recognized as County Commissioner Bradley, the same official who had questioned Frank's mental state after the airport purchase. "Bradley's been feeding Rodriguez information about local government activities for 15 years, Martinez explained. "Property acquisitions, zoning changes, economic development plans. It's a perfect intelligence operation, low profile, high-value information that helps foreign investors make strategic decisions." Frank thought about all the businesses that had closed in Millbrook, all the development projects that had failed, all the economic opportunities that had somehow never materialized. They weren't just gathering intelligence, they were sabotaging the town. "Economic warfare," Martinez confirmed. "Keep American communities weak and dependent, make them vulnerable to foreign investment and influence. It's more effective than military conquest, because the victims never realize they're under attack." A younger agent approached the table with a laptop computer. "Sir, we've intercepted communications from the Kozlov network. They're planning something for tonight." Martinez studied the screen, his expression growing increasingly grim. "They're calling it a final retrieval operation. Looks like they're not planning to retreat quietly." Frank felt ice form in his stomach. "What does that mean?" "It means they're going to try to eliminate everyone who knows about the files. You, Danny, Mrs. Chen, probably several federal agents. They'll make it look like an accident gas explosion, electrical fire, something that would destroy all the evidence." The young agent handed Martinez another report. "Local assets are being activated. We've identified at least 12 individuals in Millbrook who've received coded instructions in the past 6 hours. They're moving into position around key locations." Frank stood up abruptly. "Mrs. Chen, is she safe?" "We have agents with her, but Kozlov's people know the town better than we do. They've had decades to plan for this contingency." Martinez closed the laptop and looked directly at Frank. "I need to ask you something, and I need a completely honest answer. Are you prepared to see this through to the end, no matter what it costs?" Frank thought about Sarah's dreams, about the vintage pilot who had pointed him toward this airport, about Thomas Kowalski's 40-year mission to protect American secrets from foreign adversaries. Everything he'd learned, everything he'd discovered, had led to this moment where he had to choose between safety and justice. "What do you need me to do?" Martinez smiled grimly. Thomas left more than just files in that vault. He left weapons, communication equipment, and detailed plans for defending this facility against exactly the kind of attack Kozlov is planning. But the defense systems require someone who understands the airport's layout and mechanical systems, someone who can improvise repairs under pressure. Frank looked around the hangar that had become the center of an intelligence war that most Americans didn't even know was being fought. Morrison's service pistol lay on the desk beside Thomas's bronze star, artifacts from a conflict that had started before Frank was born and was now his responsibility to finish. "Show me what you need," Frank said. The next 6 hours were the most intensive of Frank's life. Under Martinez's direction, he activated defensive systems that Thomas had built into the airport's infrastructure over decades of careful preparation. Motion sensors, automated locks, communication jammers, and even booby traps designed to channel attackers into predetermined kill zones. Danny insisted on helping despite the obvious danger, and Frank had to admit that his son's technical skills were superior to his own when it came to the computerized systems Thomas had installed. Together, they turned Millbrook Airport into a fortress that could hold off a small army, at least temporarily. "Your father-in-law was a paranoid genius," Martinez observed as they tested the perimeter alarms. "He built this place to withstand a siege." Mrs. Chen arrived under heavy escort as the sun began to set, carrying additional boxes of documents and equipment that Thomas had stored at their house. Despite her age, she moved with the crisp efficiency of someone who had trained for this moment for decades. "Thomas always said this day would come," she told Frank as they worked side by side to program the defense systems. "He said the network would eventually become desperate enough to risk everything for these files." Frank paused in his work to study the elderly woman who had been feeding him and Danny, caring for them, protecting them without ever revealing that she was family. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" "Because Thomas made me promise to let you choose your own path. He said forcing people to carry secrets they didn't want was just another form of tyranny." Mrs. Chen's eyes softened. "But I think he always hoped you would find your way here eventually. Sarah used to talk about you in ways that reminded Thomas of himself when he was young, someone who fixed things instead of breaking them." As darkness fell over Millbrook, Martinez received word that Kozlov's assets were moving into final positions. The attack would come soon, probably after midnight, when most of the town was asleep, and emergency response times would be longest. "Last chance to reconsider," Martinez told Frank. "We can evacuate you and Danny to a safe location. Let federal agents handle the final confrontation." Frank looked at the control tower where Morrison's radio still broadcast on frequencies that connected him to intelligence networks around the world. He thought about Sarah's dreams, about the message she'd been trying to send him, about legacy and responsibility and the price of protecting the people you love. "This is where I belong," Frank said. "This is what Sarah was trying to tell me." Danny joined them at the window overlooking the runway where the final battle would be fought. "Dad, I've been thinking about what Mom would say if she were here. I think she'd tell us to fight for the truth, no matter how scared we are." Frank put his arm around his son's shoulders and felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with academic achievements or mechanical aptitude. Danny had grown into the kind of man who would stand up for his principles, even when it meant risking everything. "Then that's what we'll do," Frank said. "We'll fight for the truth." Outside, the first shadows began moving across the airport perimeter, and Frank knew that Thomas Kowalski's war was about to become his own. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just the fate of the Moscow files, but the future of a town that had been under siege for decades without knowing it. Frank checked Morrison's service pistol one more time, said a prayer for Sarah's protection, and prepared to defend the legacy that 3 generations of his family had died to preserve. The final battle for Millbrook Airport was about to begin. The attack began at 2:17 a.m. with the systematic cutting of power lines leading to the airport. Frank watched from the control tower as sections of Millbrook went dark in a carefully orchestrated sequence, isolating the airport from outside communications and emergency services. But Thomas Kowalski had anticipated this move decades ago. Backup generators hummed to life automatically, and the airport's defense systems remained fully operational. 12 vehicles approaching from multiple directions. Agent Martinez reported through the radio headset Frank wore. Professional coordination, military-style tactics. Kozlov brought everyone he had. Frank adjusted the focus on Morrison's old binoculars and studied the assault team spreading across the airport perimeter. These weren't the thugs he'd expected. They moved with the disciplined precision of special forces operatives, using cover and concealment techniques that suggested extensive military training. "Danny, how are those communication systems working?" Frank called to his son, who was manning Thomas's radio equipment from the hangar below. "Broadcasting on all emergency frequencies," Danny replied. "But they're jamming most signals. I'm not sure how much is getting through." In the distance, Frank could see muzzle flashes as the FBI agents engaged Kozlov's assault teams. The federal agents were skilled and well-equipped, but they were outnumbered and fighting on unfamiliar terrain against opponents who had spent years studying the area. Frank activated the first line of Thomas's defensive, measures motion-triggered floodlights that turned night into day across the runway area. The sudden illumination caught several attackers in the open, forcing them to dive for cover behind maintenance vehicles and concrete barriers. "Beautiful," Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. "That just bought us some breathing room." But Kozlov's forces adapted quickly. Frank watched through the binoculars as they began using smoke grenades to obscure their movements, advancing under cover of the artificial fog they'd created. Professional soldiers, definitely not the local assets Frank had expected. The control tower radio erupted with coded transmissions as Thomas's automatic systems began broadcasting distress signals on military and intelligence frequencies. Somewhere in the static, Frank heard what sounded like helicopter rotors in the distance reinforcements, he hoped, though he couldn't tell if they were friendly or hostile. An explosion rocked the hangar below, and Frank felt the control tower sway slightly. Kozlov's people had breached the perimeter and were now fighting their way through the building where the Moscow files were stored. "Dad," Danny's voice carried up the stairwell. "They're in the building. Martinez says we need to fall back to the secondary position." Frank grabbed Morrison's pistol and the bronze medal that had started this whole adventure, then descended the narrow stairs toward the hangar level. The sound of gunfire was much louder now, punctuated by shouted orders in accented English and what Frank assumed was Russian. He found Danny and Mrs. Chen in the underground operations center, along with Agent Martinez and 3 other federal agents. The walls were lined with monitors, showing camera feeds from throughout the airport complex, and Frank could see armed figures moving systematically through areas he'd spent weeks clearing and restoring. "They're not just here for the files," Martinez said grimly. "They're planting explosives. This is a scorched earth operation. They plan to destroy everything." Mrs. Chen sat at Thomas's communication console, her fingers moving across switches and dials with practiced efficiency. Despite her age, she looked completely calm, as if she'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. "Thomas always said the real battle wouldn't be about the files themselves," she said without looking up from her work. "It would be about whether America would fight to protect its secrets or let foreign enemies walk away with them." Frank studied the monitor feeds and began to understand the tactical situation. Kozlov's forces had superior numbers and training, but they were operating in an environment that Thomas had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of assault. Every corridor, every room, every exit had been designed to channel attackers into predetermined positions where they could be isolated and defeated. "The memorial plaque," Frank said suddenly, remembering something from Thomas's notes. He said the real treasure wasn't in the vault, it was in the memorial plaque. Mrs. Chen smiled and activated another series of switches. "Thomas was always dramatic, but you're right, the most important information isn't in those files. It's in the automated systems he built to ensure the truth would survive, even if we didn't." Outside, the sound of helicopter rotors was getting louder, and Frank could see new lights approaching across the Ohio countryside. Military vehicles, definitely American, with enough firepower to end this siege quickly and permanently. But Kozlov's forces had one more surprise. Through the monitors, Frank watched as a figure he recognized as the pale-eyed man from the underground confrontation approached the hangar carrying what looked like a military-grade explosive device. "Shape charge," Martinez identified, "big enough to collapse this entire building and everyone in it." Frank looked at his son, at Mrs. Chen, at the federal agents who had risked their lives to protect Thomas's legacy. The final moment of the battle was approaching, and Frank realized that everything now depended on whether a small-town mechanic could outthink professional killers who had spent their lives preparing for exactly this situation. Morrison's pistol felt heavy in his hand as Frank prepared to make the choice that would determine whether Thomas Kowalski's 40-year mission would end in victory or defeat. Frank made his decision in the space between heartbeats. While Martinez and his agents prepared for a final defensive stand, Frank slipped away through Thomas's escape tunnel, carrying Morrison's pistol and a plan that was equal parts desperation and mechanical intuition. He emerged from the tunnel system near the maintenance shed where this entire adventure had begun, close enough to see the pale-eyed man positioning his explosive device against the hangar's main support beam. The mathematical precision of the placement told Frank everything he needed to know. This wasn't just demolition, it was engineering designed to ensure that nothing inside the building would survive. But Thomas Kowalski had been an engineer too, and Frank was beginning to understand the layers of protection the old spy had built into his fortress. The shaped charge would indeed collapse the hangar, but the underground operations center was designed to survive even that level of destruction. Thomas had planned for everything, including his own death. Frank moved through the shadows with the careful steps his father had taught him during hunting trips decades ago. The pale-eyed man was focused on his technical work, adjusting timers and checking connections with the concentration of someone who took professional pride in destruction. 30 seconds to detonation, the man spoke into his radio, his accent thick with tension. Frank emerged from cover with Morrison's pistol raised. Step away from the device. The pale-eyed man turned slowly, his hand still holding the detonator. In the dim light from the hangar, Frank could see that he was younger than expected, maybe 40, with the lean build of someone who had spent years in military training. "You are the mechanic," the man said, as if Frank were an interesting specimen. "Kozlov said you would run when the shooting started." "Kozlov was wrong about a lot of things," Frank replied, keeping the pistol steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "You will not shoot me. You are not a killer." Frank thought about Sarah's death, about the years of grief and guilt that had led him to this moment, about Danny's future, about Mrs. Chen's loyalty, about Thomas Kowalski's 40-year sacrifice to protect American secrets. "You're right," Frank said. "I'm not a killer, but I'm a mechanic, and I understand how things work." Before the pale-eyed man could react, Frank shot out the device's control panel, sending sparks flying as electronic components shattered. The shaped charge was still dangerous, but without its sophisticated timing mechanism, it was just an expensive piece of metal. The pale-eyed man lunged toward Frank with practiced speed, but mechanical work had given Frank strong hands and quick reflexes. They struggled for control of the pistol, while around them, the battle for Millbrook Airport reached its crescendo. The sound of military helicopters was deafening now, and through the hangar windows, Frank could see searchlights sweeping across the runway as American forces finally arrived in overwhelming numbers. Kozlov's assault team was trapped between the FBI agents inside the building and the military units outside. Frank managed to break free from his opponent's grip and back toward the hangar entrance, keeping the pistol trained on the pale-eyed man who was now reaching for his own weapon. "It's over," Frank called out. "Your whole network is blown. Kozlov's finished." "Networks can be rebuilt," the man replied, drawing his pistol with fluid motion. "But some secrets must die with the people who know them." The final confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of someone Frank hadn't expected to see alive, Victor Rodriguez, or Kozlov, limping through the hangar entrance with blood on his shirt and desperation in his eyes. "Dmitri, we leave now," Kozlov ordered his subordinate. "The mission is compromised." But Dmitri shook his head, his pale eyes fixed on Frank with the intensity of someone who had crossed too many lines to retreat now. "The mechanic knows everything. He must be eliminated. There's no time." Dimitri's shot went wide as Frank dove behind Morrison's old workbench, the bullet sparking off concrete and steel. Frank rolled to his left and came up firing, his shots forcing both Russians to take cover behind the damaged aircraft parts that littered the hangar floor. Outside, the military helicopters were landing, disgorging soldiers who would secure the perimeter within minutes. But minutes felt like hours when Frank was trapped in a firefight with professional killers who had nothing left to lose. "Frank!" Danny's voice echoed from the underground entrance. "Dad, are you up there?" "Stay down!" Frank shouted back, not wanting his son to become a target in the crossfire. Kozlov was speaking rapidly in Russian, probably coordinating with whatever remained of his assault team. Frank couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. These were the final orders of a commander whose operation had collapsed around him. A new sound cut through the chaos, the distinctive whine of jet engines approaching fast and low. Through the hangar's broken windows, Frank saw military aircraft circling the airport like mechanical vultures, their searchlights turning night into harsh, artificial day. "This is Colonel Hayes, United States Air Force." An amplified voice boomed across the airfield. "You are surrounded. Lay down your weapons and surrender immediately." Dmitri laughed, a sound devoid of humor. American efficiency. Always too late, always too loud. He emerged from cover with his pistol raised, not toward Frank, but toward the underground entrance where Danny and the others were hidden. Frank didn't think, he simply moved, throwing himself between Dmitri's gun and the stairwell that led to his son. The bullet caught Frank in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending Morrison's pistol clattering across the concrete floor. Pain exploded through his arm and chest, but Frank stayed on his feet, driven by determination and adrenaline. Kozlov grabbed Dmitri's arm. "Enough. We go now, or we die here." But as they turned toward what Frank assumed was another escape route, Agent Martinez appeared in the hangar doorway with a tactical team behind him. The FBI agents moved with practiced precision, their weapons trained on the two Russians who suddenly found themselves with nowhere to run. "Viktor Kozlov, Dmitry Volkov, you are under arrest for espionage, murder, and conspiracy against the United States," Martinez announced with satisfaction that was audible even over the sound of helicopters and shouting soldiers. Frank slumped against the workbench, clutching his wounded shoulder, and watched as the two men who had terrorized his town for decades were finally brought to justice. Danny emerged from the underground complex and rushed to his father's side, followed by Mrs. Chen and several medics who had arrived with the military forces. "Dad, you're hurt," Danny said, his voice tight with concern. "I'm okay," Frank managed, though the pain in his shoulder suggested otherwise. "Is everyone else safe?" "Everyone's safe," Mrs. Chen confirmed, her voice carrying decades of relief. "Thomas's mission is finally complete." As military medics worked on Frank's shoulder, he watched Kozlov and Dmitri being led away in handcuffs. The banker who had seemed so respectable, so much a part of Millbrook's community, was revealed as what he'd always been, a foreign operative who had spent 35 years working to weaken and exploit the town Frank called home. Through the hangar windows, Frank could see the sun beginning to rise over Millbrook Airport, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded him of Sarah's favorite sunrise. The battle was over, the secrets were safe, and for the first time in 2 years, Frank felt like Sarah would be proud of the choices he'd made. Colonel Hayes approached with a folder thick with official documents. "Mr. Delaney, on behalf of the United States government, I want to thank you for your service to this country. The intelligence you've helped recover will prevent attacks and save American lives for years to come." Frank accepted the folder with his good hand, then looked around the hangar that had become the center of an intelligence war most Americans would never know had been fought. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Colonel Hayes said with a smile, "you get to decide what to do with the most secure airport in Ohio." 6 months later, Frank stood beside the newly installed memorial plaque at the entrance to the Thomas Kowalski Center for Aviation History, watching as the first group of school children filed past on their way to tour the restored hangar. The bronze dedication gleamed in the morning sunlight, its words simple but profound. In memory of Thomas Kowalski, Captain James Morrison, and all who served in silence to preserve freedom. The transformation of Millbrook Airport had exceeded everyone's expectations. The $200 million in recovered assets, legally francs under federal asset forfeiture laws, had funded not just the memorial, but a complete restoration of the facility. The runways were smooth and modern, capable of handling both vintage aircraft and contemporary business jets. The control tower functioned again, staffed by retired air traffic controllers who volunteered their time to support the flying museum that had become Millbrook's primary tourist attraction. Danny emerged from the hangar wearing a pilot's uniform, having completed his first solo flight in Morrison's restored Cessna just an hour earlier. The boy who had been devastated by his father's seemingly irrational airport purchase was now planning a career in aviation. Inspired by his grandfather's heroic legacy and determined to honor the family history he'd never known existed. The tour group from Indianapolis just landed, Danny reported, his face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had found his calling. 32 people, including 2 World War II veterans who knew some of the pilots who flew out of here during the war. Frank nodded, still amazed by how completely their lives had changed. The garage in town was now managed by Pete Morrison's nephew, a skilled mechanic who had returned to Millbrook specifically to work on the vintage aircraft that were becoming the center of a thriving restoration business. Frank still worked on engines, but now they were Pratt, Whitneys and Wright radials instead of Chevrolets and Fords. Mrs. Chen approached from the direction of the visitor center, moving with the spry energy of someone who had finally been relieved of a burden she'd carried for decades. She now served as the museum's official historian, sharing carefully edited versions of Thomas's story with visitors who came from around the world to learn about the secret war that had been fought in small-town America. The congressman's office called, she told Frank. The bill to designate this as a National Historic Site passed committee this morning. It should reach the floor for a full vote next week. Frank smiled at the irony. The airport that had made him a laughingstock was now being recognized as one of the most significant Cold War preservation sites in the country. The underground complex that had hidden Thomas's secrets was now a museum exhibit that educated visitors about the price of freedom and the courage of people who fought battles that could never be acknowledged publicly. The memorial had attracted more than just tourists. Several of the assets identified in the Moscow files had quietly approached federal authorities to confess their involvement and provide information about ongoing foreign intelligence operations. The network that Kozlov had spent decades building was systematically dismantled, its members either arrested or turned into double agents working for American intelligence. Rodriguez himself, Frank, still thought of him by his false name, had been sentenced to life in prison without parole after pleading guilty to espionage charges. In exchange for his cooperation, several members of his network received lighter sentences, though their careers in banking, politics, and business were permanently destroyed. Frank's shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a small scar that he sometimes touched when he was thinking about the night that changed everything. The wound had been a small price to pay for the knowledge that his family's secrets were finally safe, that Thomas Kowalski's 40-year mission had been completed successfully. As the afternoon wore on, Frank found himself in Morrison's old office, now restored to its 1950s appearance, but equipped with modern security systems that would have impressed Thomas himself. The desk where he'd found the Bronze Star was now protected behind glass, part of an exhibit that told the story of ordinary Americans who had done extraordinary things to protect their country. Danny joined him there as the last tour group departed, settling into the chair that had once been Morrison's command post. "I've been thinking about Mom," Danny said quietly, "about whether she knew what Grandpa Thomas had done, whether she suspected that Mrs. Chen was family." Frank considered the question that had haunted him for months. "I think she knew something. Maybe not the details, but she always had good instincts about people. She liked Mrs. Chen immediately, trusted her in ways that seemed to go deeper than simple friendship. And the dreams. Do you think she was really trying to tell you about this place?" Frank looked out the window at the runway, where Morrison's planes had once carried secrets that shaped the Cold War, where Thomas Kowalski had built a fortress to protect American intelligence from foreign enemies. "I think she was trying to tell me to stop being afraid," Frank said finally, "to stop hiding from the parts of life that seemed too complicated or dangerous to handle. She knew I needed to find something bigger than my own grief to give my life meaning again." Danny nodded thoughtfully. "She'd be proud of what we've built here." "Yes," Frank agreed, "she would be." As the sun set behind the restored hangar, Frank walked the perimeter of the airport one more time, following the route he'd taken that first evening when the place had seemed like nothing more than cracked concrete and broken dreams. Now it was alive again, serving pilots and preserving history, and telling the story of people who had sacrificed everything to protect the freedoms that most Americans took for granted. Frank paused at Sarah's grave on his way home, the small cemetery visible from the airport's eastern boundary. Her headstone was simple granite, inscribed with her name, dates, and the words, "Beloved, Wife and Mother." But Frank had added something newer, small bronze plaque that read, "Daughter of Heroes." "We did it," Frank said quietly, placing fresh flowers beside the stone. "We found the truth you wanted us to find. We honored your father's memory. We protected the family secrets." The evening breeze carried the sound of aircraft engines from the airport, where pilots were practicing night landings under the guidance of instructors who understood that flying was both an art and a sacred trust. Frank listened to the familiar sounds and felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had finally found his purpose. He no longer wore his wedding ring, not because he had forgotten Sarah, but because he had finally learned to carry her memory without being crushed by its weight. The love they had shared was part of him now, integrated into the man he had become, rather than a burden he had to bear. Walking home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Frank reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from grief to purpose, from isolation to community, from despair to hope. The airport had called to him, just as he'd told everyone after that first impulse purchase. But what he hadn't understood then was that the call wasn't coming from the property itself. It was coming from the people who had loved him, both living and dead, who wanted him to find his way back to the world of the living. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors to educate, new aircraft to restore, new stories to preserve. Frank looked forward to all of it, knowing that he was finally doing the work he was meant to do, in the place he was meant to be, surrounded by the family he was meant to protect. The Thomas Kowalski Center for Aviation History was more than a museum. It was a testament to the idea that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they were willing to fight for something larger than themselves. Frank Delaney, small-town mechanic turned guardian of secrets, had learned that lesson the hard way. But he had learned it completely, and he would never forget it again.